October 31st, 1859, Magnolia Ridge Plantation, Louisiana. The most terrifying night in the history of American slavery began not with chains or whips, but with whispered prayers to forgotten gods. Ezekiel Zeke Baptiste, a field hand who could read the ancient symbols carved into cypress bark, would transform from broken chattel into an instrument of otherworldly vengeance. Armed with nothing but chicken bones, graveyard dirt, and the fury of his ancestors, he would call down spirits that would tear apart overseer Thomas Calloway, piece by screaming piece, from slave to summoner, from victim to vessel of divine retribution. The blood moon hung fat and crimson above the Spanish moss, casting shadows that moved against the wind. In those shadows, something ancient stirred, something that had been waiting 3 centuries for the right combination of rage, knowledge, and celestial alignment. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows? Subscribe and comment your location to join the investigation into the darkest corners of American history. On that Halloween night in 1859, beneath Louisiana's bleeding moon, the veil between worlds grew thin as parchment. Ezekiel Baptiste, 27 years old with ritual scars covering his dark hands, knelt in the slave quarters, clutching artifacts his grandmother had smuggled from Haiti 50 years prior. His target, Thomas Calloway, the overseer who had violated his sister and murdered his unborn child with boots to her belly. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was spiritual. Calloway had desecrated the sacred grove where Ezekiel's people held their secret ceremonies, burning the altar stones and hanging their medicine bundles from oak branches like grotesque Christmas ornaments. Tonight, under the blood moon's crimson gaze, the ancestors would collect their debt. This is the true story of the Magnolia Ridge Incident. A night when slave rebellion transcended the physical realm and entered territories that would make even the most hardened overseers wet themselves in terror. Before we descend into this darkness, steel your nerves. Some stories carve themselves into your soul and refuse to leave. The great house blazed with yellow lamplight, its windows warm squares of comfort against the October chill. Inside, Master Robert Sinclair's family prepared for their Halloween masquerade, their laughter floating across the grounds like mockery made audible. Crystal clinked against crystal, silk rustled against mahogany, and the scent of roasted duck mingled with imported French perfume. But beyond the manicured gardens, past the ornamental gates, the slave quarters crouched in perpetual shadow. Here, the air tasted of unwashed bodies, rotting wood, and desperation so thick it coated your tongue. 12 families pressed into spaces meant for livestock, their children's coughs echoing off dirt floors, while Spanish moss hung from the eaves like funeral shrouds. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees after sunset, and frost was already forming on the cabin roofs. Yet the cold that seeped into the quarters went deeper than weather. It was the spiritual chill of a place where hope had been systematically murdered for generations. Ezekiel Baptiste sat cross-legged on his straw mattress, arranging his grandmother's forbidden artifacts by candlelight: a leather pouch containing dirt from 7 different graveyards, a rooster's foot, mummified and bound with red thread, glass bottles filled with mercury and Spanish needles. Each item hummed with potential energy, waiting for the blood moon to reach its zenith. The other slaves gave him a wide berth tonight. They could smell the otherworldly intent radiating from his corner like ozone before lightning strikes. Even the children stopped their crying when he began to whisper in the old tongue, words that predated English, French, and Spanish, syllables that tasted of jungle heat and sacrifice. Outside, the overseer's cabin sat dark except for one window. Thomas Calloway was inside, probably counting his monthly bonus for Maine. Maintaining discipline among the workforce. He had no idea that discipline was about to be redefined by forces far older than his bullwhip. The blood moon climbed higher, casting everything in hellish red light. In that crimson illumination, the plantation's true nature became visible, not a place of agricultural prosperity, but a wound in the earth that had been bleeding for decades. Tonight, under Ezekiel's guidance, that wound would finally speak. The veil was thinning. The ancestors were stirring. and Thomas Calloway's reckoning was about to begin. Ezekiel Baptiste's mind operated in realms invisible to white comprehension. While other slaves calculated survival in terms of avoiding the lash, he measured existence against cosmic cycles his grandmother had taught him to read in the movement of stars and the behavior of animals. His psychological landscape was a maze of inherited trauma and mystical knowledge. During the day, he picked cotton with mechanical precision, his hands moving independently while his consciousness traveled through ancestral memories. He could taste the salt spray of slave ships he'd never sailed on, feel the burn of brands he'd never received, hear the death songs of relatives who died before his birth. The rape of his sister Delphine had shattered something fundamental in Ezekiel's relationship with the physical world. When Calloway had forced himself on her in the cane mill, when her subsequent beating had killed the child in her womb, something in Ezekiel's mind had snapped clean through, not into madness, but into terrible clarity. He understood now that conventional resistance was spiritual masturbation. Running away meant abandoning the land his people had consecrated with their blood and tears. Physical violence would only bring more violence, but the old ways, the deep magic his grandmother had whispered during fever dreams, offered a different path entirely. His psychological state had shifted into something resembling religious ecstasy crossed with surgical focus. Every conversation, every glance, every breath had become part of an intricate ceremony that would culminate when the blood moon reached its apex. He no longer experienced fear or doubt, only the terrible certainty of someone who had been chosen by forces beyond human understanding. The other slaves sensed the change in him. Where once they had seen a quiet field hand with clever fingers and kind eyes, now they glimpsed something vast and hungry wearing Ezekiel's face. Children hid behind their mothers when he passed. Even the dogs refused to come near him. But Ezekiel felt no isolation, only connection. To every slave who had died on this soil, to every spirit that had been trapped between worlds by sudden, violent death. Their whispers filled his head like a choir of the damned, all of them singing the same song. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice is never truly defeated. Tonight, under the blood moon's crimson benediction, he would become their earthly instrument. Thomas Calloway had sown seeds of violence in ground already saturated with suffering. Now it was harvest time. The seeds of this supernatural vengeance had been planted on a sweltering August afternoon 3 months earlier. Delphine Baptiste, 19 years old, with her brother's intelligent eyes and their grandmother's gift for reading omens in bird flight, had been working alone in the cane mill when Thomas Calloway arrived drunk on Power and Barrel whiskey. What happened next lasted 27 minutes according to the mill's water clock, but those minutes contained centuries of accumulated rage. Calloway's violation of Delphine wasn't just rape, it was the continuation of a ritual humiliation that had begun on slave ships and continued in breeding farms across the South. But Delphine Baptiste carried more than just her own dignity. She was pregnant with her first child, conceived in love with Samuel, a free man of color who worked the riverboats. The baby represented hope, a future generation that might escape the plantation's gravitational pull toward despair. When Calloway's boots connected with her belly afterward, when she felt the warm wetness of her hope bleeding out onto the mill floor, something cosmic shifted. The child's death sent shockwaves through realms visible only to those with the sight. In the spirit world, the killing of innocence always demands payment. Ezekiel had found her there an hour later, curled around her loss like a human question mark. The rage that filled him in that moment was not merely human emotion. It was ancestral fury channeled through bloodlines that stretched back to kingdoms lost in the Middle Passage. Every ancestor who had died in chains, every grandmother who had watched her children sold away, every father who had been broken by systematic dehumanization. All of them spoke through his voice as he held his sister's trembling form. But rage without focus is just noise. Ezekiel's grandmother had taught him that true power required patience, precision, and proper celestial timing. The blood moon came only once each year, and it would not rise again until October 31st. For 3 months, he had prepared, learning the old ceremonies, gathering the required materials, fasting until his spirit body could slip easily between worlds. Every day of preparation had been both torture and prayer. Torture because justice delayed felt like complicity. Prayer because he knew the ancestors were watching. Subscribe and comment your location to join the investigation. Some stories demand witnesses. Now, under the blood moon's crimson eye, the ceremony could finally begin. Ezekiel's weapons existed in dimensions beyond the physical. While other rebellions relied on stolen knives or makeshift clubs, his arsenal consisted of artifacts that could tear holes in reality itself. The primary implement was his grandmother's gris-gris bag, sewn from cloth that had wrapped newborn slaves on 3 different continents. Inside, graveyard dirt from 7 different burial grounds, each sample collected at midnight during different phases of the moon. The dirt held the essence of the unquiet dead, spirits who had died with unfinished business, souls whose anger had calcified into something approaching weaponized hatred. Next came the rooster's foot, mummified according to Haitian tradition and bound with red thread that had been soaked in the blood of 3 different enemies. The foot would serve as a spiritual anchor, allowing the summoned entities to manifest in physical space rather than remaining trapped in the ethereal realm. The glass bottles contained his most potent ammunition: mercury for chaos, Spanish moss for binding, and water from 7 different crossroads where violent deaths had occurred. Each bottle had been blessed with words in Creole, Yoruba, and languages so old they predated written history. But the most crucial component was the ritual blade. Not for cutting flesh, but for cutting through the membrane between worlds. Forged from iron that had been struck by lightning and cooled in water where a drowning had occurred, the blade hummed with electromagnetic energy that made compass needles spin wildly in its presence. Ezekiel arranged these items in a precise pattern on the dirt floor, creating a geometric design that would serve as a spiritual antenna, amplifying his connection to forces beyond human comprehension. Each placement had to be exact. A thumb's width in the wrong direction could mean the difference between controlled moaning and catastrophic possession. The blood moon's light streamed through gaps in the cabin walls, illuminating the ritual space in hellish red radiance. As the light touched each artifact, they began to vibrate with barely contained energy. The mercury in the bottles started to move in patterns that defied gravity. The mummified rooster's foot began to twitch as if alive. The temperature in the cabin dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on the walls despite the October heat. Other slaves huddled in their corners, pulling threadbare blankets over their heads and whispering prayers in languages they barely remembered. Outside, dogs began howling in harmonies that sounded almost human. Even the insects fell silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The ceremony was ready to begin. Thomas Calloway, 34 years old, 230 pounds of concentrated malice wrapped in Confederate authority, had no idea that he was about to become the focal point of supernatural justice. In his cabin, just 50 yards from the slave quarters, he sat counting his monthly bonus, blood money earned through the systematic brutalization of human beings who shared 99% of his DNA. Born in poverty in rural Tennessee, Calloway had discovered his talent for inflicting pain during childhood, progressing from torturing stray animals to disciplining his younger siblings with methodical precision. The plantation system had provided him with the perfect outlet for his pathological need to dominate, a legal framework that transformed his sadistic impulses into economic productivity. His physical presence was designed for intimidation. Hands the size of dinner plates, scarred knuckles from decades of striking human flesh, eyes the pale blue of winter ice. He carried a black snake whip coiled on his belt like a gunfighter carries a pistol, and he knew exactly how to use it to maximize pain without reducing a slave's work capacity. But Thomas Calloway's greatest weapon was psychological rather than physical. He understood that breaking a person's spirit was more valuable than simply breaking their body. His violations of slave women weren't about sexual gratification. They were about establishing dominance, about reminding an entire community that no one was safe from his reach. The rape of Delphine Baptiste had been particularly calculated. He had chosen her not because of desire, but because she was beloved by the other slaves, a natural leader whose strength gave others hope. By violating her, by killing her unborn child, he had sought to murder hope itself. What Calloway couldn't comprehend was that some forms of suffering transcend the personal and enter the cosmic. His actions hadn't just traumatized individuals, they had torn holes in the spiritual fabric that protected the living from the hungry dead. Every scream he had extracted, every drop of blood he had spilled, every spark of hope he had extinguished had accumulated in otherworldly realms like spiritual radiation. Tonight, that radiation was about to reach critical mass. Calloway sat in his cabin, boots propped on his desk, drinking whiskey and planning tomorrow's punishments. He had no sense of the supernatural storm gathering 50 yards away, no awareness that his name was being spoken in languages that predated Christ, no understanding that forces older than European civilization had marked him for collection. The blood moon climbed toward its zenith, and Thomas Calloway's last hour of mortal existence ticked away like sand through cosmic fingers. At precisely 11:47 p.m., when the blood moon reached its apex and cast the world in crimson shadow, Ezekiel Baptiste began to speak words that had not been uttered in the Americas for 300 years. The incantation started as a whisper, syllables that seemed to originate not from his throat, but from the earth itself. As the words gained power, the temperature in the slave quarters plummeted, until breath became visible vapor and frost began forming on the walls in patterns that resembled ancient symbols. Other slaves pressed themselves against the far corners of their cabins as something vast and hungry began to respond to Ezekiel's call. The mercury in his ritual bottle started moving faster, creating spiral patterns that hurt to look at directly. The mummified rooster's foot began to convulse as if electricity was running through dead nerves. Then the voices started. First, a woman's voice speaking in Yoruba, Ezekiel's great-grandmother, who had died on the Middle Passage but whose spirit had been trapped in the plantation soil. Her words carried the rage of every mother who had watched her children sold away like livestock. Next came a man's bass rumble in Creole. Henri Baptiste, Ezekiel's grandfather, who had been worked to death in the cane fields, but whose fury had never found rest. His voice brought the accumulated anger of every slave who had died with rebellion burning in their hearts. More voices joined the supernatural chorus. Children who had been murdered for crying too loud, women who had been raped to death, men who had been beaten until their spirits fled their bodies. Each voice added another layer to a symphony of otherworldly vengeance that made the cabin walls vibrate like drumskins. 50 yards away, Thomas Calloway felt the temperature drop in his own quarters. His whiskey glass began to frost over despite the October heat. The lamp flames started flickering in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. He stood unsteadily, alcohol making his movements sluggish, and walked to his window. Outside, the blood moon hung directly overhead like a malevolent eye. The shadows cast by the trees were moving independently of the wind, reaching toward his cabin with finger-like extensions. Something was very, very wrong. In the slave quarters, Ezekiel's chanting reached a crescendo. The ritual artifacts began to levitate, spinning slowly in the air, while emitting a sound like tuning forks struck by invisible hands. The membrane between worlds was beginning to tear. Thomas Calloway's rational mind tried to dismiss what his eyes were seeing, but 3 centuries of accumulated supernatural rage doesn't care about rational minds. The shadows outside his window had taken on impossible depth, as if they were holes punched through reality itself. Something was moving within that darkness. Multiple somethings, shapes that suggested human forms, but moved with the fluid grace of smoke given murderous intent. Calloway reached for his shotgun with hands that trembled for the first time in his adult life. The metal was cold enough to burn his palms, and frost was forming along the barrel despite the weapon being inside a heated room moments before. In the slave quarters, Ezekiel's body had become a conduit for forces that made hurricanes seem gentle by comparison. His eyes had rolled back until only the whites showed, and his voice had deepened into registers that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. The words he spoke weren't just incantations. They were commands issued to entities that had been waiting centuries for permission to collect their due. The first spirit to manifest fully was Marie Laveau, not the famous New Orleans practitioner, but Ezekiel's great-grandmother, who had shared that name and carried knowledge that made the famous Marie seem like a parlor trick magician by comparison. She appeared as she had died, naked, chained, pregnant, and absolutely incandescent with fury that had been fermenting in otherworldly realms for decades. Her appearance triggered a cascade effect. Other spirits began materializing throughout the plantation grounds, an army of the murdered dead, each one carrying grievances that death had only intensified rather than resolved. They moved toward Calloway's cabin with the inexorable patience of natural disasters. Inside his quarters, Calloway's shotgun suddenly became too heavy to hold. The weapon clattered to the floor as supernatural cold sapped the strength from his muscles. His breath came in sharp puffs of vapor, and ice crystals began forming on his beard. The cabin door, locked and barred, began to bulge inward, as if something immense was pressing against it from outside. The wood groaned under pressure that shouldn't exist, and the metal hinges started to glow with heat generated by supernatural friction. Calloway opened his mouth to scream, but the cold had frozen the moisture in his throat. Only a pathetic wheeze emerged, the first sound of genuine terror he had ever made. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and otherworldly light. What entered Thomas Calloway's cabin was not bound by the laws governing physical matter. The spirits flowed through the doorway like liquid darkness given consciousness and intent, their forms shifting between human shapes and geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Great-grandmother Marie manifested first, her spectral form towering 8 feet tall and radiating cold that turned the air itself into visible sheets of crystalline vapor. Her eyes were holes punched through reality, revealing depths that contained the accumulated suffering of every woman who had been violated under slavery's protection. Behind her came Grandfather Henry, his ghostly hands still bearing the calluses of fieldwork, but now crackling with electricity that made the cabin's oil lamps explode in showers of glass and flame. His presence brought the smell of sugarcane and spilled blood, of sweat-soaked earth and burning flesh. More spirits crowded through the impossible space of the doorway, children who had died from starvation, their spectral forms flickering between innocence and accusation, men who had been lynched for imaginary crimes, their necks twisted at angles that made Calloway's own neck ache in sympathetic horror. Calloway tried to run, but supernatural cold had turned his legs to lead. He stumbled backward, crashing into his desk, sending his blood money scattering across the floor like metallic confetti. The spirits advanced with the patience of geological time. They had waited centuries for this moment and would savor every second. The first touch came from Marie's spectral fingers against Calloway's cheek. Where her hand made contact, his skin began to blacken with frostbite that burned like acid. He tried to scream, but the sound that emerged was the high whine of steam escaping from a kettle. Not human, not really sound at all. Henri's ghostly hands closed around Calloway's throat, not to strangle, but to transfer every sensation he had experienced during his own death. The crushing weight of overwork, the burning agony of muscles pushed beyond their limits, the soul-deep exhaustion of never having enough rest, food, or hope. Other spirits joined the supernatural assault, each one sharing their death experiences with the man who represented every overseer who had ever raised a whip, every master who had ever sold a child, every white man who had profited from the systematic destruction of human dignity. Calloway's body began to convulse as centuries of accumulated trauma poured into his nervous system like molten metal. This was not mere death. This was education through experience, justice through complete understanding of every pain he had ever inflicted. Dawn found Thomas Calloway's body in a condition that would puzzle doctors for generations to come. He sat upright in his chair, eyes wide open and staring at something beyond the visible spectrum. His face was frozen in an expression of such perfect terror that several hardened plantation workers would later refuse to enter the room where his corpse waited. But the truly inexplicable details emerged during the medical examination. Calloway's body showed signs of having experienced every form of torture commonly inflicted on slaves: whip marks that had appeared overnight, rope burns around his wrists and ankles despite no visible restraints, internal injuries consistent with being kicked repeatedly in the torso. Most disturbing of all, his skin had turned an ashen gray color and felt cold as winter stone despite the October heat. When the doctor attempted to close his eyes, the eyelids shattered like ice, revealing pupils that had turned completely white. The authorities found no evidence of violence, no signs of struggle, no indication that any living person had entered the cabin. The door was still barred from the inside. The windows remained locked and unbroken. Thomas Calloway appeared to have died from experiencing every form of suffering he had ever inflicted, all compressed into a single night of supernatural justice. In the slave quarters, Ezekiel Baptiste slept the deep sleep of someone whose life's work had been completed. The ritual artifacts lay scattered around his pallet, now nothing more than ordinary objects, bones and dirt and glass bottles that held no more power than any other discarded materials. But the other slaves knew what they had witnessed. They had heard the voices speaking in forgotten languages, had felt the temperature drop until frost formed on their breath, had seen shadows move independently of any light source. Most importantly, they had watched Ezekiel transform from broken field hand into something approaching a force of nature. Word spread through the slave network faster than wildfire. Not the details, those would be kept secret, but the essential message. The ancestors were still watching, still capable of intervention, still keeping accounts that would eventually be settled. Master Robert Sinclair faced a problem that no amount of money or violence could solve. His slaves had witnessed something that transcended the plantation's carefully maintained power structure, had seen proof that their oppressors were not invulnerable to consequences. The balance of terror that kept the system functioning had shifted in ways that terrified the white community far more than any conventional rebellion. The investigation into Thomas Calloway's death brought federal authorities to Magnolia Ridge Plantation, men who approached the supernatural with the confidence of people who had never encountered anything beyond their understanding. They measured, photographed, and documented everything with scientific precision, never realizing they were trying to solve a cosmic equation with arithmetic. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the federal coroner, had performed autopsies on victims of every conceivable form of violence. But Calloway's corpse challenged every assumption about how human bodies respond to trauma. The tissue damage was consistent with prolonged torture, yet there were no external wounds. The man had somehow experienced the physical sensations of being brutalized without anyone actually touching him. Spontaneous tissue necrosis brought on by extreme psychological trauma became the official cause of death, medical terminology designed to disguise the fact that modern science had no framework for explaining what had actually occurred. But the slaves knew, and more importantly, word was spreading to other plantations through networks that predated telegraph lines by centuries. The story grew in the telling, becoming mythology even as the events were still fresh. Ezekiel Baptiste's name began to be whispered in the same breath as Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, but with a crucial difference. His rebellion had succeeded without a single slave being killed in retaliation. Master Sinclair tried to maintain order through increased brutality, but his efforts only accelerated the plantation's spiritual decay. Every act of violence now felt hollow, performative rather than authoritative. The slaves had seen proof that cosmic justice existed, that their oppressors were not protected by divine mandate, but merely by temporary social arrangements that could be dissolved by forces beyond. human law. The blood moon ceremony had torn a permanent hole in the veil between worlds. Other slaves began reporting dreams where deceased relatives visited with messages and warnings. Objects started moving on their own. Temperatures would drop suddenly in rooms where overseers were planning punishments. Most significantly, the suicide rate among plantation owners in Louisiana began climbing dramatically over the following months. Men who had spent their lives inflicting suffering with complete impunity suddenly found themselves experiencing nightmares so vivid they left physical marks on their bodies. The federal government classified these incidents as hysteria brought on by regional tensions, but the pattern was too widespread and too specific to be dismissed as coincidence. Ezekiel Baptiste had not simply killed an overseer. He had fundamentally altered the spiritual landscape of American slavery. The blood moon ceremony's effects rippled outward like concentric circles on a cosmic pond, reaching far beyond the boundaries of Magnolia Ridge Plantation. Within 6 months, similar incidents began occurring across the South. Overseers found dead under impossible circumstances. Masters discovered catatonic with terror. Entire plantation hierarchies collapsing as supernatural dread infected the white community like a plague of conscience. Ezekiel Baptiste lived only 18 months after that October night, executed not for Calloway's death, which no court could prove he had caused, but for inciting insurrection through witchcraft, a charge that revealed how completely the authorities misunderstood what they were dealing with. His execution was attended by over 300 slaves who had been granted permission to witness what the white community assumed would be a deterrent spectacle. Instead, Ezekiel's death became his final transformation. As the noose tightened around his neck, witnesses reported that he smiled and spoke words in the old language that made the gallows platform vibrate like a struck bell. His body never went limp. It simply dissolved into shadow and mist, leaving behind only empty clothes and the lingering scent of sulfur mixed with sweet grass. The official records listed the execution as completed successfully, but the slaves knew better. Ezekiel Baptiste had not died. He had graduated into something approaching immortality, joining the ranks of ancestors who could be summoned when justice demanded supernatural intervention. His story became template and inspiration for resistance movements that operated in dimensions beyond physical rebellion. Slave quarters across the South began hosting ceremonies that combined African spiritual traditions with Native American earth magic and European folk practices, creating hybrid systems of power that could not be suppressed because they could not be fully understood. The Civil War, when it finally came, carried undertones of supernatural conflict that historians would later dismiss as metaphor. But the slaves who fought in that war carried amulets blessed by practitioners who had learned from Ezekiel's example. They spoke of seeing spirit armies marching alongside Union forces, of Confederate soldiers breaking and running from battlefields where no living enemy was visible. The blood moon ceremony had planted seeds that would grow into movements far larger than any single rebellion. It had proven that oppression creates its own destruction, that systematic brutality generates cosmic antibodies that eventually restore balance through means that transcend human law. The memory of that October night in 1859 burns in places where such memories are kept safe, waiting for the next time the veil grows thin and justice demands otherworldly intervention. This is not just history, it's prophecy. The blood moon rises every October, and in its crimson light, the membrane between worlds grows thin enough for the ancestors to cross. Their accounts are still being kept, their patience still accumulating interest, their justice still waiting for the right combination of rage and knowledge to call them forward. The names of the oppressed are written in books that exist beyond burning, in languages that survive the destruction of libraries, in memories that death cannot erase. Thomas Calloway learned this truth in his final moments, when every act of cruelty he had ever committed came home to collect their due with supernatural interest. Remember their names, honor their resistance, and when the next blood moon rises, listen carefully to the whispers in the darkness. The ancestors are still there, still watching, still keeping score. Subscribe to witness more stories that history tried to bury. Comment your location and join the investigation into the supernatural resistance that shaped America from the shadows. Some truths can only be told when the veil is thin and the dead demand their due. The ceremony continues. The justice never sleeps. And somewhere in the space between worlds, Ezekiel Baptiste is still teaching his people how to call down the spirits when mercy fails, and only cosmic intervention can balance the scales.